My name is Rebecca Sterling. I'm 28 years old, and I'm sitting in my Denver apartment staring at the most devastating text message I've ever received. The family group chat that usually buzzes with weekend plans and birthday reminders now contained just one brutal message from my mother. "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us completely." I read it over and over, my hands shaking as I tried to understand what I'd done wrong. Just 2 weeks ago, we'd all been together at Uncle Howard's funeral, hugging and crying and supporting each other through our grief. But what they didn't know was that Uncle Howard had left me something that would expose every single one of them. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this family betrayal unfolds and how I discovered the shocking truth about the people I thought loved me most. Growing up, everyone always said the Sterling family was picture perfect. We were the kind of family that looked like we belonged in a holiday card, with our matching Christmas sweaters and coordinated vacation photos that my mother Margaret posted religiously on social media. I was the so-called golden child, the one who graduated summa cum laude from University of Colorado, landed a high-paying marketing director position at 30,000 feet altitude, and always stepped up when family members needed financial help. Whether it was covering Brittany's credit card debt or helping Cameron with his construction business startup costs, I was the reliable one, the successful one, the one everyone could count on. But the real heart of our family was Uncle Howard, my father's older brother who became my anchor after Dad died in a car accident when I was 16. Uncle Howard was everything I aspired to be: wise, generous, and fiercely protective of the people he loved. He owned a successful chain of hardware stores across Colorado and had never married or had children of his own, so he poured all his paternal energy into being the best uncle imaginable. Every Sunday, I drive the 45 minutes from Denver to Colorado Springs to have dinner with him, and we'd spend hours talking about everything from business strategies to life philosophy. He taught me about investments, about standing up for myself, and most importantly, about recognizing genuine love versus manipulation. Uncle Howard's house was this beautiful Victorian mansion that he'd restored himself, filled with antiques and family photos spanning 4 generations. The dining room table could seat 12 people, and during holidays, it groaned under the weight of Margaret's elaborate spreads while we all gathered around sharing stories and laughter. At least, that's what I thought was happening. Looking back now, I realize I was so focused on Uncle Howard's warmth and wisdom that I missed the subtle dynamics playing out around me. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room, the glances exchanged when I wasn't looking, the careful way certain topics were avoided in my presence. The funeral 2 weeks ago had seemed like a celebration of Uncle Howard's incredible life. The church was packed with hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched through his business dealings, his charitable work, and his genuine kindness. I delivered the eulogy, sharing stories about his mentorship and the way he'd helped shape me into the person I'd become. Margaret hugged me tightly afterward, telling me how proud Uncle Howard would have been of my words. Brittany squeezed my hand and whispered that we'd get through this together. Cameron and Ashley, our cousins, took turns sharing their favorite memories of Uncle Howard's terrible dad jokes and his legendary barbecue skills. Travis, Brittany's husband, even offered to help me sort through Uncle Howard's belongings when I was ready. For 3 days after the funeral, everything seemed normal. We texted about funeral arrangements and thank you cards. Margaret called to check on me, knowing how close Uncle Howard and I had been. Then suddenly, radio silence. No responses to my messages about getting together for Sunday dinner, like we always did. No replies to my photos of the beautiful flower arrangement someone had sent. Nothing. Until that devastating group text that felt like a punch to the gut, especially coming from people who had just been holding my hand and promising we'd support each other through our grief. The confusion was overwhelming because I genuinely couldn't think of anything I'd done wrong. I replayed every conversation from the funeral, every interaction, every moment, searching for some clue about what had shifted. That's when I remembered Uncle Howard's final gift to me, something he'd insisted on giving me privately just a week before he passed away. It was his grandmother's antique jewelry box, an ornate wooden piece with intricate carved roses and a secret compartment that he'd shown me when I was little. At the time, I'd been touched by the gesture, but assumed it was just a sentimental keepsake. But as I sat there holding my phone with that cruel message glowing on the screen, something told me to examine that jewelry box more carefully. Hidden in the secret compartment, tucked behind a small mirror, was a brass key attached to a white envelope with my name written in Uncle Howard's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope was a brief note. "Rebecca, this key opens my safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box number 472. If you're reading this and the family is turned against you, everything you need to know is in that box. Trust no one but Patricia Wells, and remember that I chose you for a reason. All my love, Uncle Howard." My hands were trembling as I read those words, because somehow, impossibly, Uncle Howard had predicted exactly what was happening. The question was, what had he discovered about my family that he felt I needed to know? The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with Uncle Howard's key clutched in my sweaty palm, my mind racing with possibilities about what I might find. The bank manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd known Uncle Howard for decades, personally escorted me to the safety deposit box area after verifying my identification and the documentation Uncle Howard had left granting me access. Box 472 was larger than I'd expected, and when Mrs. Patterson left me alone in the small private viewing room, I lifted the lid with my heart pounding in my chest. What I found inside would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The box contained a thick leather-bound journal, several manila envelopes stuffed with documents, Uncle Howard's cell phone with a note saying the passcode was my birthday, and a sealed letter marked "Read this first" in his distinctive handwriting. I opened that letter with trembling fingers, and Uncle Howard's voice seemed to reach out from beyond the grave. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and the family has shown their true colors after my death. For the past 6 months, I've been documenting conversations and behaviors that have broken my heart. I always suspected there was resentment brewing beneath the surface, but I never imagined the depth of their deception until I started paying closer attention." The journal contained 20 years' worth of observations, but the most devastating entries were from the past year. Uncle Howard had meticulously documented family gatherings, recording not just what was said in front of me, but what happened before I arrived and after I left. Entry after entry revealed a pattern of cruel comments and calculated manipulation that made my stomach turn. Margaret had apparently been calling me the charity case ever since my father died, resentful that Uncle Howard had stepped into a paternal role in my life. She told other family members that I was manipulative and always playing the victim to get sympathy and money. Brittany's entries were even more painful because I'd always thought we were close despite our 3-year age difference. According to Uncle Howard's notes, Brittany had been telling people for years that I acted superior and holier than thou just because I'd been successful in my career. She'd apparently complained bitterly about Uncle Howard's obvious favoritism toward me, saying it wasn't fair that he helped me with college expenses and career advice while treating her like just another niece. The journal revealed that Brittany had been struggling with gambling addiction for over 2 years, something she'd hidden from everyone except Travis, and she'd been hoping Uncle Howard would bail her out of her debts. But the most shocking discovery was Uncle Howard's phone, which contained dozens of audio recordings he'd made secretly during family gatherings over the past 8 months. He'd apparently started recording after overhearing a particularly vicious conversation about me, and what I heard on those recordings destroyed any remaining illusions I had about my family's love. In one recording from Thanksgiving, I could hear my own voice in the background helping Margaret in the kitchen while Cameron and Ashley sat in the living room dissecting my personality. Cameron called me fake nice and said I only helped people financially to make myself feel important. Ashley agreed, adding that I was probably lonely and pathetic, using money to buy people's affection because I had no real friends. The most devastating recording was from Christmas Day, just 3 weeks before Uncle Howard's death. While I was outside playing with Travis's kids, the adults had apparently gathered in the dining room to discuss Uncle Howard's declining health and their expectations about his will. Margaret's voice was crystal clear as she said, "Rebecca thinks she's so perfect with her fancy job and her perfect life, always showing off her success like she's better than the rest of us. She's been sucking up to Howard for years, probably hoping to inherit everything." Brittany chimed in with, "She acts like she's the only one who cares about him. But where was she when he had pneumonia last winter? I was the one bringing him soup every day." Of course, that was a complete lie because I'd taken a week off work to care for Uncle Howard during that illness, but apparently, the truth didn't matter when it came to rewriting history. The manila envelopes contained even more damaging evidence. Screenshots of a family group chat that didn't include me, where they'd been discussing Uncle Howard's assets and speculating about his will for months. Cameron had apparently done extensive research into Uncle Howard's property values and business worth, creating spreadsheets estimating the estate's total value. Travis had contributed information about tax implications and inheritance laws, clearly indicating this was a coordinated effort. Most shocking of all was a thread from just 2 days after Uncle Howard's diagnosis with lung cancer, where they were already planning how to divide his possessions and suggesting that I should be managed to ensure I didn't get more than my fair share. The final envelope contained the will itself along with a letter from Uncle Howard's attorney explaining that the family had been pressuring Uncle Howard to change his will right up until his death. Apparently, Margaret had arranged multiple meetings with Uncle Howard over the past year, not to spend quality time with him as I'd assumed, but to advocate for a more equitable distribution of his assets. She'd argued that since I was successful and financially stable, I didn't need an inheritance the way Brittany and Cameron did. Cameron had even gone so far as to ask Uncle Howard directly to invest in his failing construction company, positioning it as a way to keep the family business legacy alive. But Uncle Howard had been smarter than any of them realized. His final letter to me revealed that he'd suspected their motives for months and had been testing their sincerity by occasionally mentioning different inheritance scenarios to see how they'd react. When he told Margaret he was considering leaving everything to charity, she'd exploded in anger, revealing her true feelings about his autonomy and his right to dispose of his own assets as he saw fit. When he mentioned to Cameron that he might sell the hardware stores and donate the proceeds, Cameron had launched into a lengthy argument about family loyalty and responsibility that confirmed Uncle Howard's worst suspicions about his nephew's motivations. The will was straightforward and devastating in its implications. Uncle Howard had left his entire estate, worth approximately $2.8 million to me. Not a cent went to Margaret, Brittany, Cameron, Ashley, or anyone else in the family. His reasoning, as explained in an attached letter, was that I was the only family member who had loved him unconditionally, without regard for what I might inherit. He'd watched me succeed professionally and financially without ever asking him for anything beyond his time and advice. He'd seen me help other family members generously without keeping score or expecting anything in return. Most importantly, he'd realized that I was the only one who would honor his memory and values rather than simply liquidating his assets for personal gain. Sitting in that sterile bank room surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, I finally understood why they'd sent that brutal text message. It wasn't about needing distance from me emotionally, it was about positioning themselves legally and socially for the will contest they were undoubtedly planning. They wanted me isolated and defensive, cut off from family support, so I'd be more likely to negotiate or settle rather than fight for what Uncle Howard had legitimately left me. But as I carefully packed all the evidence back into the safety deposit box, I realized that Uncle Howard had given me something far more valuable than money. He'd given me the truth, and the truth was going to set me free. Armed with the devastating knowledge from Uncle Howard's safety deposit box, I decided to give my family one last chance to be honest with me. I called my mother that evening, my voice carefully neutral, as I asked if we could talk about why everyone wanted distance from me. Margaret's response was colder than I'd ever heard her voice before, devoid of any maternal warmth or concern for my feelings. She told me that the family had been discussing my behavior and had decided that I'd been inappropriate in my relationship with Uncle Howard, implying without directly stating that I'd somehow manipulated or taken advantage of him during his illness. When I pressed her for specifics about what I'd allegedly done wrong, Margaret became defensive and accusatory, claiming that I'd isolated Uncle Howard from the rest of the family and filled his head with ideas about who really cared about him. She said that my constant visits and phone calls had been excessive and that I'd made other family members feel unwelcome in Uncle Howard's home. According to her twisted narrative, I'd systematically poisoned Uncle Howard against his own family while positioning myself as his sole caregiver and confidant. The lies were so elaborate and so far from reality that I almost admired their creativity, but mostly I felt sick listening to my own mother rewrite history to justify their upcoming assault on Uncle Howard's final wishes. The conversation ended when Margaret informed me that the family had already consulted with an attorney named Jonathan Pierce about contesting Uncle Howard's while on the grounds of undue influence. She claimed they had evidence that I'd manipulated Uncle Howard during a period when his judgment was compromised by illness and medication. This was particularly galling because Uncle Howard had been mentally sharp right up until his peaceful death in his sleep, maintaining his business interests and engaging in complex financial discussions until the very end. But I knew from the recordings in his safety deposit box that truth wasn't going to matter much in their carefully constructed narrative. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Brittany that was so venomous it made Margaret's coldness seem warm by comparison. My sister's voice was slurred with alcohol and shaking with rage as she called me pathetic and manipulative, accusing me of playing the victim my entire life while secretly scheming to steal Uncle Howard's money. She said I'd always been jealous of her relationship with him, which was laughable considering I had documentation of her complaining about his favoritism toward me. But the most hurtful part was when she said that everyone had always known I was fake, that my kindness and generosity were just acts to make people feel obligated to me. She ended the voicemail by saying that she'd rather die than let me get away with stealing what belonged to the whole family. That afternoon, Cameron showed up at my apartment unannounced, putting on a performance of concerned family member that might have been convincing if I hadn't heard his recorded comments about my character. He sat on my couch drinking the coffee I'd offered him and speaking in soothing tones about how the family was just processing grief differently and maybe we could work through our misunderstandings. His real purpose became clear when he started talking about the burden of inheriting Uncle Howard's estate, how difficult it would be to manage all those properties and business interests, and how generous it would be if I considered sharing the inheritance with family members who were struggling financially. Cameron's manipulation was sophisticated and almost gentle, appealing to my sense of fairness and family loyalty while painting himself and the others as innocent victims of Uncle Howard's poor judgment. He suggested that Uncle Howard had been influenced by pain medication and grief over my father's death to make decisions that didn't reflect his true wishes for the family. He even pulled out his phone to show me photos of his young children, emphasizing how much they'd benefited from their great-uncle's generosity and how sad it would be if they couldn't continue visiting the family properties for holidays and celebrations. It was emotional blackmail disguised as reasonable conversation, and it might have worked if I hadn't already heard him calculating Uncle Howard's net worth like an accountant. While Cameron was trying to manipulate me into voluntary surrender, Ashley was conducting a social media campaign designed to make me look unstable and vindictive. She posted vague but pointed messages about family members who turn against their own blood and shared inspirational quotes about dealing with toxic people who use grief as an excuse for selfish behavior. Her posts were carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while clearly implying that I was the source of family conflict. She shared memories of Uncle Howard that portrayed him as confused and easily influenced in his final months, laying groundwork for their legal challenge while making me appear to be the aggressor in our family dispute. The most insidious part of their strategy was how they were systematically rewriting the narrative of my relationship with Uncle Howard, turning my genuine love and care for him into evidence of manipulation and schemes. They were telling extended family members and family friends that I'd isolated Uncle Howard, controlled his access to others, and filled his head with paranoid ideas about people trying to take advantage of him. It was classic projection, accusing me of exactly what they had been doing while positioning themselves as the real victims of my alleged manipulation. I spent that entire week second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe there was some truth to their accusations, if maybe I had been too possessive of Uncle Howard's attention or too eager to help him with his affairs. The gaslighting was effective because it played on my natural tendency towards self-reflection and my genuine desire to be fair to everyone involved. For a few dark days, I actually considered just giving them the money to restore peace to the family, even though I knew Uncle Howard would be devastated to see his final wishes ignored. But then I remembered something Uncle Howard had told me during one of our last conversations, when he'd seemed unusually serious and focused. He'd said that the hardest lesson he'd learned in life was that sometimes loving someone means disappointing them, that real love requires making difficult choices that others might not understand or appreciate. He talked about the importance of staying true to your values even when people you care about try to make you feel guilty for having boundaries. At the time, I'd thought he was speaking generally about life philosophy, but now I realized he'd been preparing me for exactly this moment. That's when my phone rang with a call from someone who would change everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the woman's voice on the other end was warm and familiar even though I couldn't immediately place it. She introduced herself as Patricia Wells, Uncle Howard's longtime secretary and office manager, and said she had information I needed to hear about what my family had really been doing behind my back. Her words sent chills down my spine as she asked if we could meet in person because what she had to tell me was too dangerous to discuss over the phone. I agreed immediately, sensing that Patricia might be the ally Uncle Howard had mentioned in his letter, the one person I could trust in this nightmare of family betrayal. Patricia Wells met me at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Denver, her silver hair perfectly styled and her blue eyes sharp with intelligence and concern. She'd worked for Uncle Howard for 15 years, managing his business correspondence and personal affairs with the efficiency and discretion that had made her invaluable to his operations. As we settled into a corner booth away from other customers, Patricia explained that she'd been wrestling with her conscience ever since Uncle Howard's funeral, watching my family's behavior and knowing truths they thought were safely buried with my uncle. The first bombshell Patricia dropped was that my family had been pressuring Uncle Howard to change his will for months before his death, but not in the way I'd imagined. Margaret hadn't just been making casual suggestions about inheritance planning. She'd been conducting a systematic campaign to convince Uncle Howard that I was financially irresponsible and would waste his legacy. She told him that I was secretly struggling with debt despite my apparent success, that I'd been asking her for money regularly, and that I was already spending money I didn't have in anticipation of inheriting his estate. None of this was true. But Margaret had presented her lies so convincingly that Uncle Howard had actually asked Patricia to quietly investigate my financial situation. Patricia produced a manila folder containing copies of emails and documents that painted a picture of calculated manipulation that made my stomach turn. Travis, who I'd always liked for his apparent devotion to Brittany and his kids, had been researching Uncle Howard's assets for over a year, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked property values, business revenues, and potential tax implications. He'd even gone so far as to contact Uncle Howard's financial advisors and insurance companies under the guise of helping with estate planning, gathering information that could only be useful for challenging whatever decisions Uncle Howard made. The evidence showed that Margaret had been visiting Uncle Howard multiple times a week during his final months, not out of sudden affection but as part of a careful monitoring operation. She'd been reporting back to the others about his physical condition, his mental state, and his conversations with doctors and lawyers. Patricia had found it strange how Margaret always seemed to know about Uncle Howard's medical appointments and business meetings, until she realized that Margaret had been systematically questioning the cleaning lady, the landscaper, and even the mail carrier to keep track of Uncle Howard's activities and visitors. Cameron's role in the conspiracy was particularly calculating and cruel. He'd been using his construction business connections to get estimates for renovating Uncle Howard's properties, presenting these as helpful suggestions while actually positioning himself to benefit from any inheritance through his professional services. He'd convinced Uncle Howard to let him inspect the Victorian mansion's foundation and electrical systems, claiming concern for his uncle's safety while actually cataloging valuable improvements that would increase the property's worth. Patricia showed me invoices proving that Cameron had been charging Uncle Howard inflated prices for minor repair work, essentially stealing from him while pretending to help. But the most devastating revelation was about Brittany's visits to Uncle Howard during his illness. I genuinely believed that my sister was developing a closer relationship with our uncle, spending time with him and helping him feel less isolated during his treatment. The truth was that Brittany had been systematically stealing from Uncle Howard during these visits, taking small but valuable items like silver serving pieces, antique jewelry, and collectible coins that she assumed wouldn't be missed immediately. Patricia had security footage from Uncle Howard's home system that clearly showed Brittany slipping items into her purse and bags during supposedly innocent family visits. Patricia's most damaging evidence came from her access to Uncle Howard's email accounts and phone records, which revealed the full scope of the family's coordination and planning. There was an email thread dating back 8 months where Margaret, Cameron, Ashley, and Travis discussed managing Uncle Howard's decline and ensuring that his assets were protected from poor decisions. They'd researched guardianship laws and undue influence statutes, clearly planning to challenge any will that didn't meet their expectations. They'd even consulted with multiple attorneys before settling on Jonathan Pierce, apparently shopping for someone who would be aggressive enough to pursue their claims regardless of the evidence. The smoking gun was a series of text messages between Margaret and Brittany from the week after Uncle Howard's funeral, where they celebrated the fact that I seemed to be falling apart from grief and would be easier to manipulate in my emotional state. They'd specifically planned to isolate me from family support immediately after the will reading, believing that loneliness and guilt would make me more willing to negotiate rather than fight for my inheritance. Margaret had even suggested that they should make me feel responsible for tearing the family apart by refusing to share Uncle Howard's legacy with his other relatives. Patricia also revealed that the family's attorney had advised them to create a documented history of my allegedly unstable behavior and inappropriate influence over Uncle Howard. This explained Ashley's social media campaign and Brittany's recorded voicemail. They weren't just venting their anger. They were building a case file for their legal challenge. The attorney had apparently told them that will contests were easier to win when they could demonstrate a pattern of manipulation and isolation, so everything they were doing was designed to create evidence of my supposedly predatory behavior. The most chilling discovery was that they'd planned to claim Uncle Howard was suffering from dementia or medication-induced cognitive impairment during the time he made his final will. Patricia showed me medical records proving this was completely false. Uncle Howard had undergone comprehensive cognitive testing just 2 months before his death and had scored in the superior range for his age group. But the family had hired a medical expert witness who specialized in posthumous competency evaluations, someone who would testify that Uncle Howard's cancer treatment could have affected his judgment even without obvious symptoms. As Patricia finished laying out the evidence of my family's elaborate deception, I felt a strange combination of vindication and heartbreak. Vindication because I finally understood that their rejection had nothing to do with anything I'd actually done wrong, and heartbreak because I had to accept that the people I'd loved most had never really loved me back. Patricia handed me copies of everything she'd shown me, explaining that Uncle Howard had asked her to compile this evidence in case the family turned against me after his death. He'd suspected their true motives, but had hoped until the very end that they might surprise him by showing genuine grief and respect for his wishes. The final piece of Patricia's revelation was that Uncle Howard had actually changed his will twice in his final year. The first change had been to leave everything equally divided among all his relatives, but after discovering the extent of their scheming and manipulation, he'd made a second change, leaving everything to me. Patricia had been present when Uncle Howard recorded a video message explaining his reasoning, a recording that was safely stored in his attorney's vault along with other evidence of his mental competency and clear understanding of his decisions. My family's case was not just ethically wrong, it was legally doomed because Uncle Howard had anticipated their every argument and carefully documented his reasoning. Walking back to my car after that meeting with Patricia, I felt like I was seeing my family clearly for the first time in my adult life. All those years of feeling grateful for their love and acceptance, all those times I'd attributed their occasional coldness or criticism to stress or misunderstandings, all those moments when I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive about subtle slights and exclusions. It turned out my instincts had been right. but I'd been too generous and too hopeful to trust what I was sensing. Uncle Howard had seen the truth and had tried to protect me from it while he was alive, and now his final gift was giving me the tools to protect myself from their cruelty and greed. The next morning, I woke up feeling different, stronger, like Uncle Howard's evidence had burned away the fog of self-doubt and family conditioning that had been clouding my judgment. Instead of spending another day agonizing over what I might have done wrong or how I could fix our relationship, I focused on what I was going to do right, how I was going to honor Uncle Howard's trust and protect his legacy from people who saw it as nothing more than a financial opportunity. My first call was to Patricia, asking her to recommend an attorney who specialized in will contests and had the backbone to fight against the kind of coordinated attack my family was mounting. Patricia connected me with a law firm that had been handling estate disputes for over 30 years, and when I met with the senior partner, Margaret Ross, I knew I'd found the right advocate. Margaret was a formidable woman in her 60s who listened to my story without judgment and reviewed Uncle Howard's evidence with the sharp eye of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. She assured me that my family's case was legally weak, but warned that they might escalate their personal attacks to try to pressure me into settling. She was right about the escalation, but even she was surprised by how quickly and viciously my family would reveal their true characters. The first sign that they knew I was fighting back came when Margaret called my office pretending to be concerned about my mental health. She spoke to my boss, Daniel Rodriguez, claiming that I was having a breakdown and might need professional help or time off to deal with my grief. She painted a picture of me as someone who was so devastated by Uncle Howard's death that I wasn't thinking clearly about family relationships or financial decisions. It was a clever move because it positioned her as the caring mother while making me seem unstable, and if Daniel had been anyone other than the ethical, thoughtful leader he was, it might have damaged my career. Fortunately, Daniel called me immediately after Margaret's call, more concerned than suspicious, and when I explained what was really happening, he was appalled by my family's tactics. As someone who'd worked with me for 4 years, he knew my character and professionalism well enough to recognize manipulation when he saw it. He assured me that my job was secure and offered me whatever time and support I needed to deal with the legal challenges ahead. Having my employer's backing was crucial because it meant my family couldn't attack my professional reputation or financial stability as part of their strategy to make me appear incompetent. My decision to go public with the truth was strategic rather than emotional, though I'll admit there was satisfaction in finally being able to tell my side of the story. I reached out to a reporter at the Denver Post who specialized in human interest stories, and after verifying the key facts with Patricia and my attorney, she wrote a piece about inheritance disputes and family manipulation that used my situation as a case study. The article was careful not to name my family members directly, but it painted a clear picture of their tactics while highlighting Uncle Howard's character and his reasons for his final decisions. The article hit like a bombshell in our extended family and social circles, because suddenly people had context for the vague accusations and implications my family had been spreading. Instead of seeing me as a greedy relative who was tearing the family apart, readers saw me as someone defending an elderly man's final wishes against relatives who'd been scheming for his money while he was dying. The piece included quotes from Patricia about Uncle Howard's mental sharpness and his deep disappointment when he realized his family's true motives, which effectively countered their planned narrative about his incompetence. Cameron's response to the article was to show up at my office building, apparently thinking that confronting me publicly would make me look guilty or unstable. He waited in the lobby until I came back from lunch, then launched into a loud tirade about family loyalty and the importance of honoring Uncle Howard's real wishes rather than decisions made under duress. He accused me of manipulating the media just like I'd supposedly manipulated Uncle Howard, and his voice got louder and more aggressive until building security had to intervene. The entire scene was captured on security cameras, providing perfect documentation of the harassment and instability my attorney would later use in court. My countermoves were planned with Margaret Ross's guidance and executed with surgical precision. When I discovered that Travis had a criminal record for assault and fraud that he'd hidden from the family, I made sure this information reached the mortgage company that was processing their application for a new house. When Cameron's construction business was exposed as operating without proper licenses and insurance, I provided that information to his clients and the Better Business Bureau. When Margaret tried to change Uncle Howard's insurance beneficiaries by forging his signature, I presented that evidence to both the insurance company and the local police, forcing her to hire an expensive criminal defense attorney. Each revelation about my family's deception and criminality made their contest look more like a shakedown attempt and less like a legitimate legal challenge. Ashley, realizing that the ship was sinking and she was going down with it, made a desperate attempt to switch sides by calling me with a tearful confession about being forced to participate in the family's schemes. She claimed that Margaret and Cameron had pressured her into going along with their plans and that she'd always felt guilty about attacking me. But her performance was too little and too late, especially since I had recordings of her enthusiastically participating in their planning sessions. The legal tide turned decisively when Margaret Ross filed a motion to dismiss my family's will contest, accompanied by Uncle Howard's video testimony and the extensive evidence of their coordination and bad faith. Jonathan Pierce, their attorney, withdrew from the case after reviewing the evidence, apparently deciding that his professional reputation wasn't worth defending clients who'd clearly lied to him about the facts. Without legal representation and facing potential criminal charges for document forgery, my family's united front began to crumble as each member started looking out for their own interests. The most satisfying moment came when I received a panicked call from Margaret, my mother, begging me to drop the criminal charges against her and offering to abandon the will contest in exchange for my mercy. Her voice had none of the cold authority she displayed during our previous conversations. Instead, she sounded desperate and frightened, finally realizing that her schemes had consequences she hadn't anticipated. I listened to her pleas with the same emotional distance she'd shown me when delivering that brutal text message, and I told her that she'd made her choices and would have to live with the results. But the victory that mattered most wasn't legal or financial. It was personal. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing my family clearly without the filter of hope or the distortion of manipulation. I wasn't the selfish, manipulative person they'd tried to make me believe I was. I was someone who'd loved generously and trusted deeply, only to discover that my love had been exploited and my trust had been betrayed. Uncle Howard had seen this day coming and had given me the tools not just to defend myself, but to understand that their rejection was a reflection of their character, not mine. As I prepared for the legal battle ahead, I felt Uncle Howard's presence guiding me toward a strength I hadn't known I possessed. He taught me that real love doesn't make demands or keep score, that genuine family bonds are based on respect and care rather than obligation and guilt. My biological family had failed that test spectacularly, but Uncle Howard's love had given me the foundation to stand against their attempts to break me down. The money was just money, but my integrity and self-worth were treasures that no one could steal from me, no matter how hard they tried. As my family's legal case disintegrated and their public reputation crumbled, their attacks on me became increasingly desperate and personal. The veneer of concern and family loyalty that had initially masked their greed completely disappeared, replaced by raw anger and a vindictiveness that shocked even me, despite everything I'd learned about their true characters. Brittany's behavior became particularly erratic and threatening, as if losing the inheritance had triggered something dangerous in her personality that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The first sign that things were spiraling out of control came when Brittany showed up at my apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, clearly intoxicated and barely coherent with rage. She pounded on my door so hard that my neighbors came out to see what was happening, and when I reluctantly let her in, she immediately launched into a screaming tirade about how I destroyed our family and stolen her children's future. Her accusations were wild and contradictory, claiming simultaneously that I'd brainwashed Uncle Howard and that he'd never really loved any of us anyway. She reeked of alcohol, and her eyes had a wild, unfocused look that frightened me more than her angry words. What scared me most about that confrontation was how Brittany seemed to genuinely believe her own lies, as if she'd convinced herself that her version of events was reality, and I was somehow gaslighting her by refusing to accept responsibility for imaginary crimes. She accused me of turning Uncle Howard against her by telling him about her gambling problems, even though he discovered her debts on his own when she'd asked him for money. She claimed I'd manipulated him into cutting off financial support to the family, when in reality, he'd just gotten tired of being treated like a personal ATM by relatives who only visited when they needed something. The situation escalated when Brittany refused to leave and threatened to make me pay for what I'd done to our family. I ended up calling the police, who arrived to find her trying to break my living room window with a decorative stone from my balcony garden. The officers were professional but firm, arresting Brittany for domestic violence and property damage while she screamed accusations about me stealing money that belonged to her children. The incident report became part of the growing file of evidence showing that my family's opposition to Uncle Howard's was motivated by greed and desperation rather than legitimate legal concerns. Margaret's response to Brittany's arrest was to claim that I'd driven my sister to a breakdown by refusing to share Uncle Howard's inheritance with people who needed it more than I did. She launched a social media campaign painting me as heartless and vindictive, sharing photos of Brittany's children and asking people to pray for a family torn apart by one person's greed and selfishness. The manipulation was sophisticated, appealing to people's natural sympathy for children while carefully avoiding any mention of the evidence, showing why Uncle Howard had made his decisions or the criminal behavior that had led to Brittany's arrest. The fake medical crisis Margaret orchestrated was perhaps the most manipulative move in her entire playbook because it was designed to exploit my genuine love for her despite everything she'd done. She called me from the hospital emergency room, claiming she was having chest pains and heart palpitations brought on by the stress of our family conflict. Her voice was weak and shaky as she begged me to visit her, saying she was terrified she might die without making peace with her daughter. The maternal guilt was overwhelming, and despite my attorney's warnings about potential manipulation, I couldn't ignore the possibility that my mother was genuinely ill and needed my support. But when I arrived at the hospital, Margaret's performance fell apart under scrutiny. The medical staff seemed confused by my presence, and when I asked specific questions about her condition, their answers didn't match the emergency she described over the phone. A sympathetic nurse finally pulled me aside and explained that Margaret had presented with anxiety symptoms that could have been stress-related, but all her cardiac tests were normal and she'd been cleared for discharge hours earlier. She'd been refusing to leave and insisting they call her daughter, apparently planning to use my arrival as evidence that I still cared about family relationships despite my legal actions. Cameron's business collapse became a public spectacle that revealed just how far his criminal behavior extended beyond his attacks on Uncle Howard's estate. My investigation into his construction company had uncovered a pattern of contractor fraud stretching back 3 years, involving inflated estimates, substandard materials, and projects left unfinished after customers had paid deposits. When local news stations picked up the story, more victims came forward with similar experiences, and Cameron faced potential criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. His response was to blame me publicly, claiming I destroyed his livelihood out of spite and vindictiveness. The irony was that Cameron's illegal business practices had nothing to do with our inheritance dispute, but his guilt and paranoia made him assume I was responsible for his exposure. He gave interviews to local television stations portraying himself as a hard-working family man whose life had been destroyed by a vindictive relative who couldn't stand to see others succeed. He claimed I'd used my connections and resources to launch a campaign against his business, when in reality his criminal behavior had simply caught up with him at an inconvenient time. His public meltdowns actually helped my case by demonstrating the kind of person who is challenging Uncle Howard's will. Ashley's attempt to defect from the family alliance was too transparently self-serving to be effective, but it provided valuable insight into the internal dynamics that had driven their conspiracy. She contacted my attorney directly, offering to testify about the planning and coordination that had gone into their will contest in exchange for immunity from any potential criminal charges related to their schemes. Her statement revealed that Margaret had been the driving force behind the family's activities, orchestrating their meetings and coordinating their attacks, while positioning herself as the grieving sister-in-law who just wanted to honor her deceased brother-in-law's true wishes. According to Ashley's testimony, The family had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my personal life, hoping to find evidence of financial problems, substance abuse, or relationship issues they could use to support their claims about my character. When that investigation turned up nothing useful, they'd considered hiring someone to create compromising situations they could document and present as evidence of my instability. Ashley claimed she'd been uncomfortable with these more extreme tactics, but her phone records showed she'd been an enthusiastic participant in all their planning sessions until it became clear their strategy was failing. The nuclear option that Travis had researched involved claiming that Uncle Howard had been suffering from undiagnosed dementia or medication-induced cognitive impairment when he made his final will. They'd found a medical expert witness who specialized in posthumous competency evaluations, someone who would testify that cancer patients often experienced cognitive decline that wasn't immediately obvious to family members or even medical professionals. This expert was willing to review Uncle Howard's medical records and provide an opinion that his judgment was impaired, despite never having examined him while he was alive and despite clear evidence of his mental sharpness right up until his death. The desperation of their tactics reached a crescendo when they hired a public relations firm to launch a coordinated attack on my reputation through social media and local news outlets. They created fake social media accounts to spread rumors about my mental health and financial stability, posted negative reviews of my employer's business claiming I was unstable and unreliable, and even contacted my former college roommates fishing for embarrassing stories they could use against me. The campaign was so obviously coordinated and malicious that it backfired spectacularly, generating sympathy for me while making them look like exactly the kind of people who would harass a dying man for his money. But perhaps the most revealing moment came when I realized that their anger wasn't really about the money, it was about being exposed. They'd spent years constructing a narrative where they were the good family members, and I was the selfish outsider, and Uncle Howard's had shattered that comfortable fiction. They couldn't accept that someone they dismissed and diminished had been chosen over them, that their victim had turned out to be the victor, that their careful manipulation had been seen through and rejected by the person whose opinion mattered most. Their escalating attacks weren't just about trying to get Uncle Howard's money. They were about trying to destroy the evidence that they'd been wrong about everything, including themselves. As I watched my family destroy their own reputations and relationships in their desperate attempts to punish me for winning, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I was witnessing the complete moral collapse of people I'd once loved, and relief because their behavior was making it impossible for me to doubt the rightness of Uncle Howard's decision. He'd chosen correctly, and their response to his choice was proving his wisdom better than any evidence my attorney could have presented in court. As my family's attacks intensified, I discovered something Uncle Howard had known all along, that real strength comes not from blood relations but from the genuine connections we build with people who share our values and respect our character. The allies who emerged to support me during this nightmare were people I'd never expected to stand up for me, individuals whose lives Uncle Howard had touched and who recognized the difference between his legacy of kindness and his relatives' campaign of greed and manipulation.
Dr.
Sarah Mitchell, Uncle Howard's primary care physician for over 20 years, was the first medical professional to step forward with testimony that completely demolished my family's claims about his mental competency. Dr. Mitchell had conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment on Uncle Howard just 6 weeks before his death as part of his routine cancer care, and his scores were not just normal for his age group, they were superior. She explained that cancer patients often worried about mental fog or confusion from their treatments, so Uncle Howard had specifically requested the testing to ensure he was thinking clearly about important decisions. The results showed that his memory, reasoning, and judgment were all functioning at levels that would be enviable in someone half his age. More importantly, Dr. Mitchell provided detailed testimony about Uncle Howard's concerns regarding his family's sudden interest in his financial affairs. During their private conversations, Uncle Howard had expressed worry that his relatives seemed more concerned about his estate planning than his actual health and comfort. He told Dr. Mitchell that family members were pressuring him to make changes to his will and had been asking increasingly intrusive questions about his assets and business investments.
Dr.
Mitchell's medical notes from those appointments documented Uncle Howard's clear thinking about family dynamics and his sadness over discovering their true motivations. Helen Rodriguez, Uncle Howard's next-door neighbor for 15 years, provided testimony that painted a vivid picture of the way my family had been treating him during his final months. Helen had been working in her garden one afternoon in late January when she heard loud voices coming from Uncle Howard's house, and when she looked over the fence, she could see Margaret and Cameron through the kitchen window, having what appeared to be a heated argument with Uncle Howard. Helen couldn't make out the specific words, but Uncle Howard's body language suggested he was upset and defensive, while Margaret was gesturing aggressively and Cameron was pointing his finger accusingly. After they left, Helen had gone over to check on Uncle Howard and found him sitting at his kitchen table, looking defeated and sad. What made Helen's testimony particularly powerful was her description of how Uncle Howard's demeanor changed whenever I visited compared to when other family members came by. She'd observed hundreds of visits over the years and noticed that Uncle Howard always seemed energized and happy when my car pulled into his driveway, often coming out to greet me with a big smile and a warm hug. In contrast, when Margaret or Cameron visited, Uncle Howard would watch from his window before opening the door, and Helen could tell by his posture and expression that he was bracing himself for difficult conversations rather than looking forward to pleasant family time. Pastor Mark Williams from Uncle Howard's church provided another crucial piece of the puzzle when he revealed that Uncle Howard had sought pastoral counseling about his family situation during the last 6 months of his life. Uncle Howard had been deeply troubled by what he perceived as his relatives' changing attitudes toward him, sensing that their increased attention was motivated by self-interest rather than genuine care. Pastor Williams had counseled Uncle Howard through his disappointment and hurt as he gradually realized that people he'd loved and supported for decades were viewing him primarily as a source of future inheritance rather than a family member worthy of respect and affection. According to Pastor Williams, Uncle Howard had struggled with guilt over his growing distrust of his family, wondering if he was being unfair or overly suspicious of their motives. The pastor had encouraged Uncle Howard to trust his instincts while continuing to hope for the best from his relatives, but had also counseled him about the importance of making decisions based on his own values and judgment rather than family pressure or expectations. Pastor Williams's testimony showed that Uncle Howard's final will wasn't the product of manipulation or diminished capacity, but rather the result of careful consideration and painful acceptance of truths he'd hoped weren't real. Perhaps the most damaging testimony against my family came from Patricia Wells, whose 15-year relationship with Uncle Howard gave her unique insight into his character, his values, and his growing disillusionment with his relatives. Patricia had witnessed firsthand the way family members had started treating Uncle Howard's office visits like opportunities to gather intelligence about his financial affairs rather than chances to spend quality time with him. She'd seen Margaret rifling through papers on Uncle Howard's desk while he was in the bathroom, and she'd overheard Cameron asking detailed questions about property values and business revenues that had nothing to do with casual family conversation. Patricia's most powerful testimony involved Uncle Howard's emotional state during his final months, when he confided his heartbreak over realizing that his family's love had apparently been conditional on their expectations about his will. She described finding Uncle Howard in tears after a particularly manipulative visit from Margaret, where he'd been pressured to make immediate decisions about his estate planning while he was feeling weak and vulnerable from his cancer treatment. Patricia had never seen Uncle Howard so defeated and sad, and she'd encouraged him to take his time, making important decisions rather than giving in to family pressure during a period of grief and illness. The security footage from Uncle Howard's home surveillance system provided irrefutable evidence of my family's behavior during their visits to his house. The cameras, which Uncle Howard had installed for safety reasons after a neighborhood break-in, captured audio and video of family interactions that contradicted everything they'd claimed about their relationships with him. The recordings showed Margaret searching through Uncle Howard's desk and filing cabinets when she thought he was napping, Cameron measuring rooms and photographing valuable items under the guise of helping with maintenance, and Brittany slipping silver serving pieces and small antiques into her purse during supposedly innocent social visits. But the most revealing footage was from the day after Uncle Howard's funeral, when Cameron and Travis had used their keys to enter his house and spend over 2 hours going through his belongings and papers. They'd clearly been searching for additional copies of his will or other documents that might affect the inheritance, and their conversation was picked up clearly by the security system's audio recording. They discussed which items they wanted to claim before the estate was settled and speculated about whether Uncle Howard might have hidden cash or valuable items in unexpected places throughout the house. My attorney Margaret Ross used this evidence to file additional charges against my family members, including breaking and entering, theft, and destruction of evidence. The criminal charges created serious legal jeopardy for them while further undermining their credibility as potential beneficiaries of Uncle Howard's estate. No judge would look favorably on relatives who'd been stealing from the deceased while simultaneously claiming they deserved his inheritance because of their close relationships with him. The private investigator I'd hired, Morris Campbell, had been documenting my family's activities and had uncovered evidence that their coordination went far beyond what even I had suspected. Morris discovered that they'd been meeting regularly for over a year to discuss Uncle Howard's declining health and their strategies for managing his estate decisions. They'd created detailed files on his assets, his social connections, and his personal vulnerabilities, approaching his final illness like a military campaign rather than a family health crisis. Morris also uncovered evidence that my family had been spreading rumors about my mental health and financial stability throughout our extended family and social networks, laying groundwork for their claims that I was unsuited to inherit Uncle Howard's estate. They'd contacted my former employers, my college friends, and even my dental hygienist fishing for negative information they could use against me. The systematic nature of their character assassination campaign showed that their attacks on me weren't emotional reactions to Uncle Howard's will. They were calculated strategies that had been planned and executed over many months. As all this evidence accumulated, I began to understand that Uncle Howard's decision to leave everything to me hadn't just been about rewarding my loyalty or punishing their greed. He'd been trying to protect his legacy from people who would have squandered it on gambling debts, failed businesses, and personal luxuries rather than using it to make a positive impact on the world. Uncle Howard had built his wealth through hard work, honest business practices, and careful planning, and he'd wanted his legacy to reflect those same values. My family had demonstrated through their own behavior that they were exactly the wrong people to be trusted with that responsibility. The courtroom was packed on the morning of our hearing, with local reporters drawn by the human interest angle of a family inheritance dispute that had exposed decades of hidden resentment and manipulation. Judge Patricia Chen, known for her no-nonsense approach to estate law and her intolerance for frivolous litigation, presided over proceedings that would finally determine whether Uncle Howard's wishes would be honored or whether my family's greed would be rewarded. As I sat at the defendant's table with my attorney Margaret Ross, I felt Uncle Howard's presence beside me, guiding me through the most important fight of my life. My family's new attorney, a desperate-looking man named Robert Carlson, who'd apparently been willing to take their case despite its obvious weaknesses, opened with arguments that sounded increasingly hollow as he tried to present my grieving relatives as the real victims of Uncle Howard's poor judgment and my manipulative influence. Carlson claimed that Uncle Howard had been isolated from his family by my constant presence and had been convinced to change his will through a campaign of emotional manipulation designed to turn him against his other relatives. The arguments might have been effective if they hadn't been contradicted by overwhelming evidence of my family's own scheming and criminal behavior. Margaret's testimony was the first crack in their carefully constructed facade, and watching her fall apart under cross-examination was both satisfying and heartbreaking. My mother, who'd always prided herself on her composure and social grace, became increasingly flustered and defensive as Margaret Ross systematically exposed the lies and contradictions in her story. When confronted with recordings of her own voice calling me manipulative and predatory, Margaret claimed she'd been upset and hadn't meant what she'd said, but the recordings clearly showed calculated planning rather than emotional outbursts. The moment that destroyed Margaret's credibility completely came when she was asked to explain her forged signature on Uncle Howard's insurance documents. She first claimed she'd never seen the documents before, then suggested that Uncle Howard must have asked her to sign them, then finally admitted she'd signed his name but insisted she'd been trying to help him manage his affairs during his illness. Judge Chen's expression grew increasingly stern as Margaret contradicted herself repeatedly, clearly lying under oath while trying to maintain the pretense that her motives had been pure and family-oriented. Cameron's testimony was even more damaging to their case because his criminal history and business practices had already been exposed through my investigation. When he tried to portray himself as a concerned nephew who'd only wanted to help Uncle Howard manage his properties, Margaret Ross produced invoices showing he'd been overcharging Uncle Howard for construction work while conducting unauthorized inspections that were clearly designed to catalog valuable assets. Cameron's explanation that he'd been giving Uncle Howard family discounts fell apart when the invoices showed he'd been charging premium prices for substandard work. But the most explosive moment came when Cameron was confronted with security footage showing him and Travis searching through Uncle Howard's house after the funeral. The video clearly showed them discussing which items they wanted to claim and speculating about hidden valuables, completely contradicting their claims that they'd only entered the house to secure it against potential burglars. When Cameron tried to claim they'd been protecting Uncle Howard's belongings for the family, Margaret Ross played audio of him telling Travis that the old man probably has cash stashed all over this place and suggesting they should take what we can before Rebecca gets her hands on everything. Brittany's explosive breakdown in the witness chair was the moment when whatever remained of my family's credibility completely evaporated. She'd been drinking before the hearing despite explicit instructions from their attorney, and her testimony quickly devolved into an incoherent rant about how I'd always been the favored child and how Uncle Howard had never really loved any of them. She accused me of brainwashing Uncle Howard while simultaneously claiming he'd been mentally incompetent, contradicting her own family's legal arguments while revealing the depth of resentment and entitlement that had motivated their actions. When Margaret Ross asked Brittany to explain the valuable items that had been found in her possession after Uncle Howard's death, including silver pieces and antique jewelry that clearly belonged to his estate, Brittany's response was to scream that she'd earned those items through years of visiting and caring for Uncle Howard. She claimed I'd never really cared about him and had only visited him to secure my inheritance, which was particularly ironic given that she was literally on trial for stealing from him while I was defending his clearly stated wishes. Travis's testimony revealed the calculating nature of their conspiracy, while demonstrating that their attacks on Uncle Howard's mental competency were completely without foundation. As someone with a criminal record for fraud, Travis was hardly a credible character witness, but his detailed knowledge of Uncle Howard's assets and his methodical approach to researching inheritance law showed that their challenge to the will had been planned and coordinated rather than driven by genuine concern for Uncle Howard's welfare. Travis had clearly been the strategic mastermind behind many of their schemes, using his criminal experience to plan their approach to challenging the will. The prosecution's presentation of Uncle Howard's final video message was the emotional climax of the hearing and the moment that definitively settled the case in my favor. Uncle Howard appeared on the courtroom's large screen looking frail but mentally sharp, speaking directly to the camera with the clear intention of explaining his decisions to anyone who might question them after his death. His voice was steady and his reasoning was logical as he explained that he'd realized his family's love had been conditional on their expectations about his inheritance, while my relationship with him had always been based on genuine affection and shared values. In the video, Uncle Howard specifically addressed each family member's behavior and explained how their actions had influenced his decision-making. He described Margaret's manipulative visits and her attempts to convince him that I was financially irresponsible, Cameron's transparent attempts to profit from their relationship while gathering intelligence about his assets, and Brittany's theft of valuable items during supposedly caring visits. Uncle Howard's sadness was evident as he spoke about realizing that people he'd loved and supported for decades had been viewing him primarily as a source of future wealth rather than a family member worthy of respect. But the most powerful moment in the video came when Uncle Howard spoke directly about me and explained why he'd chosen to leave his entire estate in my care. He talked about my genuine love for him, my integrity in our business discussions, and my generosity toward other family members even when they treated me poorly. Uncle Howard explained that he trusted me to use his legacy wisely and to honor his memory through charitable work and family support, while he'd lost confidence that his other relatives would do anything beyond liquidating his assets for personal gain. The family's reaction to Uncle Howard's video revealed their true characters more clearly than any testimony could have. Instead of showing respect for his reasoning or sadness about his disappointment in them, they became visibly angry and defensive, whispering furiously among themselves and shaking their heads as if Uncle Howard was still somehow being manipulated even from beyond the grave. Their inability to accept responsibility for their own behavior, even when confronted with Uncle Howard's clear explanation of his reasoning, demonstrated exactly why he'd been right to exclude them from his inheritance. Judge Chen's ruling was swift and decisive, delivered with a sharpness that left no doubt about her opinion of my family's case and their courtroom behavior. She ruled that Uncle Howard's will was legally valid and had been made by someone with full mental capacity who understood the consequences of his decisions. She noted that the evidence showed Uncle Howard had been manipulated not by me, but by family members who tried to pressure him into changing his will to benefit their own financial interests while he was vulnerable and ill. More significantly, Judge Chen ordered my family to pay all my legal costs and awarded me additional damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm they'd caused through their frivolous lawsuit and their campaign of harassment. She specifically noted that their behavior had been reprehensible and designed to punish the rightful beneficiary for the deceased's legitimate decision to reward loyalty over blood relations. The judge's comments would become part of the public record and would serve as a permanent rebuke to their greed and manipulation. As we left the courtroom that day, I felt Uncle Howard's vindication as much as my own. His final wishes had been honored, his reasoning had been understood and respected, and his assessment of his family's character had been proven completely accurate. The money was important, but what mattered most was that Uncle Howard's voice had been heard and his values had been upheld against people who would have trampled on both in pursuit of their own selfish interests. Justice had been served, and UNC. 6 months after the court victory that vindicated Uncle Howard's final wishes and exposed my family's true character, I found myself standing in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows of his restored Victorian mansion, now officially mine but forever his in spirit. The legal battles were behind me, the stolen items had been returned to the estate, and my family's criminal charges had been resolved through plea bargains that included restitution and community service. But the real transformation had been internal, a journey from devastation to empowerment that Uncle Howard had somehow anticipated and prepared me for through his final gift of truth. The Howard Sterling Foundation had become my way of honoring Uncle Howard's values and ensuring his wealth would create positive change in the world rather than simply enriching people who'd shown themselves unworthy of his trust. We focused on mentoring disadvantaged youth, providing scholarships for students whose dreams exceeded their financial resources, and supporting small business owners who embodied the honesty and hard work that had characterized Uncle Howard's own career. Every program we funded reflected his belief that success should be shared generously with others, but only with those who would use opportunity wisely and gratefully. Working with the foundation had introduced me to people who shared Uncle Howard's values and who appreciated the difference between genuine generosity and manipulative gift-giving. Board members like Dr. Amanda Foster, my therapist who'd helped me process the trauma of family betrayal, and Morris Campbell, the private investigator who'd become a trusted friend, formed the core of what I'd come to think of as my chosen family. These were people who valued integrity over convenience, truth over comfortable lies, and authentic relationships over obligatory blood connections. My professional life had flourished as well, partly because of the confidence I'd gained from successfully defending Uncle Howard's legacy, and partly because my colleagues respected the grace under pressure I'd shown during months of family attacks. Daniel Rodriguez had promoted me to Senior Marketing Director, recognizing that someone who could handle family manipulation and legal warfare while maintaining professional excellence would be invaluable in managing difficult client relationships and high-stress projects. The skills I developed during the inheritance battle, strategic thinking, evidence analysis, and emotional resilience, had made me better at my job and more respected by my peers. The therapeutic journey with Dr. Foster had been essential for processing not just the immediate trauma of family betrayal, but the lifetime of subtle manipulation and emotional conditioning that had made me vulnerable to their gaslighting attempts. Through our sessions, I'd learned to recognize the difference between healthy family loyalty and toxic obligation, between genuine love and performative affection designed to maintain control. Most importantly, I developed the emotional tools to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear of abandonment or guilt over disappointing others. One of the most healing aspects of my recovery had been connecting with other people who'd experienced similar family betrayals and inheritance disputes. Through support groups and online communities, I'd met dozens of individuals whose families had revealed their true characters when money was involved, people who'd been gaslit and manipulated by relatives who saw them as obstacles to wealth rather than human beings worthy of love and respect. Sharing stories and strategies with these survivors had helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique and that healing was not just possible, but inevitable for those willing to do the work. The unexpected reconciliation attempt from Ashley had tested my newly developed boundaries and my commitment to prioritizing my own well-being over family peace. She'd reached out through Patricia Wells, asking for a private meeting where she could apologize for her role in the family's conspiracy and explain the pressures she'd felt to participate in their schemes. I'd agreed to meet with her, but only in a neutral location with clear limits on what I was willing to discuss and what outcomes were possible. Ashley's apology had seemed genuine, and her explanation of feeling caught between loyalty to her parents and her own moral discomfort with their tactics had resonated with some of my own experiences growing up in our dysfunctional family system. But when she'd asked about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship and whether there might be some way for her to benefit from Uncle Howard's estate through the foundation or other charitable giving, her true motivations became clear. Even her apology had been strategic, designed to position her for financial gain rather than genuine reconciliation. My response to Ashley's manipulative apology had been firm, but not cruel. I'd explained that forgiveness didn't require restoration of our previous relationship, that I could release resentment without opening myself up to future manipulation. I'd offer to pay for family counseling if she genuinely wanted to address the dysfunctional patterns that had enabled our family's toxic behavior, but I'd made clear that any ongoing relationship would need to be based on completely different terms than what we'd had before. Ashley had declined my offer, apparently disappointed that forgiveness didn't come with financial benefits, which confirmed the wisdom of maintaining strong boundaries. The romance that had developed with David Chen, a fellow volunteer at one of the Foundation's mentorship programs, had shown me what healthy love looked like when it was based on genuine compatibility rather than family obligation or social expectation. David was a social worker who'd overcome his own difficult family background to build a career helping troubled teenagers, and he understood both the pain of family dysfunction and the possibility of creating better relationships through intentional choices. Our connection was based on shared values, mutual respect, and authentic affection rather than guilt, obligation, or financial considerations. David's reaction to learning about my inheritance and family situation had been the opposite of what I'd experienced with my biological relatives. Instead of seeing my wealth as something he was entitled to benefit from, he'd been impressed by my commitment to using Uncle Howard's legacy responsibly and had offered to help with the Foundation's work without any expectation of personal gain. His respect for my boundaries and his appreciation for my strength had been healing in ways I hadn't expected, showing me that not everyone would try to exploit my generosity or manipulate my emotions. The most challenging test of my new boundaries had come when Margaret, my mother, had sent a desperate letter asking for financial help after Travis left Brittany and moved out of state to avoid his criminal charges. Margaret's letter had been masterfully crafted to appeal to my sympathy without taking any responsibility for the family's previous behavior, describing Brittany's depression and financial struggles while carefully avoiding any mention of the gambling addiction, theft, or harassment that had contributed to her problems. My response to Margaret's manipulation attempt had been firm, but not vindictive. I'd offered to pay for addiction counseling and mental health treatment for Brittany, but only if she was willing to acknowledge her destructive behaviors and commit to genuine change. I'd also offered to fund family therapy sessions if Margaret wanted to explore the dysfunctional patterns that had enabled years of manipulation and emotional abuse within our family system. But I'd made clear that I wouldn't provide money that could be used to continue destructive behaviors or reward people for refusing to take responsibility for their actions. Margaret's angry response to my conditional offer of help had confirmed that her concern was financial rather than emotional, focused on getting access to Uncle Howard's money rather than actually helping Brittany recover from her addictions and mental health issues. She'd accused me of being heartless and controlling, using my wealth to manipulate family relationships just like she'd claimed Uncle Howard had done. The irony was lost on her, but it served as a final confirmation that cutting ties with these toxic relationships had been necessary for my own well-being and growth. The first anniversary of Uncle Howard's death had been both sad and celebratory, a day for grieving his absence while honoring the incredible impact his love and wisdom had made on my life. I'd spent the morning at his graveside, sharing stories about the Foundation's work and thanking him for the courage he'd given me to choose authenticity over approval, truth over comfortable lies, and genuine love over obligatory relationships. His final lesson had been the most valuable gift he could have given me, the understanding that real family is created through choice and commitment rather than accidents of birth. Standing in the garden he'd loved, surrounded by the roses he'd tended and the memories we'd created together, I'd felt profound gratitude for the man who'd seen my potential when I couldn't see it myself, and who'd protected me from people who would have diminished that potential for their own gain. Uncle Howard had known that I would need to be strong enough to stand alone before I could be wise enough to choose healthy relationships, and his final gift had forced me to develop that strength while giving me the resources to use it wisely. The book I was writing about inheritance disputes and family manipulation had become both a therapeutic exercise and a practical guide for others facing similar challenges. Publishers had expressed interest in the story, not just because of its dramatic elements, but because of its practical insights into recognizing and responding to family manipulation tactics. I'd been invited to speak at legal conferences and support groups, sharing strategies for protecting yourself when people who are supposed to love you reveal themselves to be something else entirely. My final reflection on the journey from devastation to empowerment was that Uncle Howard had been right about everything, from his assessment of our family's character to his prediction that I would need to fight for my inheritance and my integrity. He'd prepared me as much as possible for the battle ahead, but he'd also trusted me to find the strength and wisdom to handle challenges he couldn't fully anticipate. His love had given me the foundation to stand against manipulation and abuse, while his final gift had given me the tools to build a better life on that foundation. As I locked up the Victorian mansion and drove back to my own home in Denver, I carried with me the peace that comes from knowing you've honored someone's trust and protected their legacy against people who would have desecrated both. Uncle Howard's money would continue to do good in the world through the Foundation's work, helping young people achieve dreams that might otherwise remain impossible. But more importantly, his love had helped me become the kind of person who deserved that trust, someone strong enough to stand alone when necessary and wise enough to build authentic relationships when the right people came along. The final victory wasn't legal or financial, though both had been important for practical reasons. The real victory was personal and emotional, the transformation from someone who accepted manipulation as the price of family love to someone who demanded authenticity as the foundation of any meaningful relationship. Uncle Howard had seen that potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself, and his final gift had forced me to develop that potential while giving me the resources to use it for good in the world. What happened to my family taught me that some people will always choose greed over love, manipulation over honesty, and entitlement over earned respect. But Uncle Howard's legacy taught me that other people, the ones worth keeping in your life, will choose differently. They'll celebrate your success rather than trying to exploit it, support your growth rather than trying to control it, and love you for who you are rather than what you might do for them. Those are the people who become your real family, and those are the relationships that make life worth living. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family loyalty versus personal boundaries. Have you ever had to choose between keeping toxic family members in your life or protecting your own well-being? Drop your experiences in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family manipulation and finding your own strength. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to choose yourself over family expectations, and remember that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones you most need protection from. Thank you for letting me share Uncle Howard's story and mine, and I hope it helps you recognize the difference between genuine love and manipulative control in your own relationships. Until next time, remember that you deserve relationships based on respect and authenticity, not guilt and obligation.